Hey, it's Chris, the Supply Chain Doctor. Over the years, I've interviewed some of the brightest minds and successful leaders in supply chain management. In May 2020, I sat down with supply chain leader Ken Ackerman to learn more about him and collect a little supply chain management history. After the interview, Ken told me about a similar interview he had with Dr. Jim Stock many years prior, and the related work Dr. Stock did. In November 2020, I was able to catch up with Dr. Stock to learn about him and his work. As an academic in the world of transportation, logistics, and what we now call supply chain management, Jim was well connected to many of the original academic thought leaders in the space. Jim did interviews with many of these thought leaders and shared them with me. The list includes Ken Ackerman, Don Bowersox, James Haskett, Bud LaLonde, John Langley Jr., Tom Menser, Tom Spee, and Daniel Wren. To carry on the great work started by Dr. Jim Stock, I'm dusting off these interviews and bringing them to you to help you get a better understanding of supply chain management and hopefully become a more effective supply chain professional.
My name is James Stock, Professor of Marketing and Logistics at the University of South Florida. We're here today to conduct an interview with one of the luminaries in the academic disciplines of logistics and supply chain management. The purposes of this interview are several. First, and perhaps foremost, is to get to know the personal side of one of the leading logistics and supply chain academicians, a person who's had significant influence on their profession. We often read the person's books and journal articles. We listen to their presentations at academic professional meetings, sometimes even have individual discussions with them at various events and venues. However, we rarely get to know the person beyond the professional aspects of their careers. In the field of literature and art, for example, researchers often consider the what, why, how, who, and when of a particular book or painting, short story, poem, or whatever. They speculate on what might have motivated the writer or artist to write the book or to paint the painting, to determine the message or story of the text or the art, and the writer's or artist's perception of the contributions of their work. In the same way, through this and other interviews that will be conducted of leading business scholars, as Paul Harvey so often has expressed, we will attempt to get the rest of the story. These videotaped interviews will hopefully serve as supporting material for various university courses where the various works of these academicians may be discussed. They will be a significant impact in courses where history and theory are being examined, since these individuals contributed extensively to that history and theory. Each interview is based on a set of structured questions using an interview guide. Of course, the interviewee's responses are spontaneous. They may lead to other questions related to those responses. However, the general format for this and other interviews that will be conducted in the future will be similar. It's hoped that audiences who view these interviews will get a broader and richer view of the people and events that have shaped their disciplines. We hope that you will learn from what will be said and discussed during these interviews and be able to more fully appreciate and understand the significant contributions made by these luminaries in the field. Let's begin by introducing our distinguished guest. Dr. Bernard J. LaLonde, or Bud as those who know him, is presently Professor Emeritus at The Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. He graduated from the University of Notre Dame with a Bachelor of Arts in Economics. He obtained an MBA from the University of Detroit and received his PhD in Business Administration from Michigan State University. He assumed his first academic position as assistant professor at the University of Colorado in 1961, was promoted to associate professor during his tenure there. From 1965 to 1969, Bud was on the faculty of Michigan State University, where he was promoted to full professor and coordinator of the food marketing program. In 1969, he was hired by The Ohio State University as a James R. Riley Professor of Marketing and Logistics. He remained at Ohio State for the remainder of his career until 1995, when he retired and was awarded the title of Professor Emeritus. While at OSU, Bud held various positions academically and administratively. From 1980 to 1983, he was Associate Dean of Graduate Programs and Continuing Education. From 1985 to 1995, Bud was appointed the Raymond E. Mason Professor of Transportation and Logistics. During his career, Bud has received numerous awards for achievement, including the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals Distinguished Service Award for Outstanding Achievement in Logistics and Supply Chain Management. He has received the Harry E. Salzberg Medallion from Syracuse University and the Eccles Medal from Seoul, the International Society of Logistics, and numerous other awards and recognitions. He was the founding editor of the Journal of Business Logistics, which today is the premier academic journal in logistics and supply chain management. He has served as a member of the editorial boards of the International Journal of Physical Distribution and Logistics Management, the International Journal of Logistics Management, Journal of Marketing Education, Marketing Management, Transport Logistics, and many others. He has published more than 150 articles, monographs, books, and book chapters that appeared in almost every major marketing, logistics, and supply chain academic and professional publication. He was also co-author of one of the earliest college textbooks on physical distribution, which influenced literally thousands of logistics students in the U.S. and throughout the world. Especially significant is that Bud has served as dissertation chairperson for more than 60 doctoral students, many of whom have become leading educators and researchers in the disciplines of marketing and logistics. Examples include Shelby Hunt, Michael Levy, Douglas Lambert, and this interviewer. Over the years, Bud has had a keen interest in marketing and logistics history. For many years after the passing of Dr. Robert Bartels, he taught the doctoral seminar in the history of marketing thought. He's an avid collector of first editions of early marketing and logistics books. It is our distinct pleasure to get to know the personal side of this man so that we can more fully appreciate his significant professional contributions and achievements. All right, welcome. We're going to go through a series of questions that will explore the background of Bud LaLonde, and as we go through, I think you'll get a very fascinating picture of this individual. Bud, back to your early childhood, sort of the standard question. When and where were you born?
I was born in the depths of the Depression, 1933, in Detroit, Michigan. I lived in Dearborn. However, my parents lived in Dearborn, and I grew up in Dearborn, which is kind of a company town for the Ford Motor Company.
Sure. Was there something or anything in your childhood that shaped your present personality?
Well, it's hard to say. I think that if someone were to describe me as a child, they'd probably just first describe me as somebody with their face in a book all the time. And I suppose in some sense that since that's a thing academics do, I guess it did shape my longer term career options.
Were there any personality traits that you had as a child that drove you to succeed, or maybe alternatively impeded your progress?
Well, I think I grew up in a family that valued education, I speculate about that because my father finished high school, my mother finished to the 8th grade, and she lived in a family of 12, and it was the role of the girls in that family. 8 years of education was enough, and then they helped out with the care and feeding of 8 brothers. And so, however, the kind of I guess conundrum in a way is that I have 3 sisters, and all 4 of us are teachers in one form or another, and here we grew up in a family where neither of our parents graduated from college, and somehow they were able to instill that thirst for knowledge and teaching in all of their children. I don't know how they did it. I'd like to know.
Okay. Well, you mentioned your parents. How do you think they would have described you as a child?
Like I said, a kid with his face always in a book. I was bookish, and I did other things. I played softball and football, and so on. And I had other interests, but most of them centered around learning and knowledge, and it was a privilege to be able to do that at that age and at that time, because, as I said, we were in the depths of the Depression when I was growing up.
Now, do you have any specific memories as a child that you've never forgotten? Things that were significant in some way that you still remember even now?
I remember the beginning of World War II for two reasons. One reason is we were listening to the radio at that time, and no living color, but we were listening to the children in England being shipped off to the countryside because they were afraid of bombing in London and so on. And at about that time, I was 7 or 8 years, and I remember speculating on what it would be to be taken away from your family and moved to some strange hinterland. And I've never forgotten that for some reason. The second thing that I recall is we had a young fellow that rented part of our home, the upper level of our home, and he was a military officer. And I remember the attack on Pearl Harbor, and all the commotion, and he was gone the next day. Those are kind of childhood memories that I've never forgotten.
Okay. Now, thinking back to your your secondary education years, where did you attend school? Primarily in Dearborn area or elsewhere?
I went to St. Alphonsus in Dearborn for the first 8 years. Then, for high school, I went to Catholic Central High School, which is a college prep school, and it was probably a major event in my life, because I would say I would classify myself as an average to a slightly above average student for my first 8 years. And when I got into a college prep environment, there was a lot more pressure to succeed, and the competition was tougher, and I thrived in that environment. My first year I had trouble, a little bit of trouble anyway, with Latin and a few other things, and the quantity worked. But the last 3 years I had straight A average, and it convinced me that I could perform at the academic level. It gave me the self-confidence, and it was a kind of a turning point in my life.
Well, while you were in high school, what was your favorite subject or subjects to study, and why was that?
Well, surprisingly, they were chemistry, physics, and I think part of the reason was the nature of inquiry in those sciences and the amount of closure you get. You know, like the periodic table. You know there's a box there, and you can describe it, what's in that box, but it hasn't been discovered yet. And what it does is that it creates a sense of excitement on participating in science. It also gives you closure. You know, there are answers to a lot of the things. I enjoyed most of my courses and did well in most of my courses, but particularly those were my first introduction to the sciences, and I thought they were particularly important.
You had mentioned some interest when you were growing up in high school. Did you play on any sports teams, and what was your favorite sport?
I played football and baseball, and my favorite sport was baseball. I played at football because I was big, and it was the right thing to do, given my size and so on. But I never really had my heart in it. And baseball I really liked.
Okay. And what position were you playing in baseball?
Catcher.
Catcher.
And I also pitched, and later on in softball.
Ah, very good. Were you involved in any school activities such as clubs and societies and so on?
And my major activity in high school was the yearbook. In my senior year, I was editor of the yearbook, and that was almost a full-time job besides going to school. And it was a completely volunteer organization, and it was also my first experience with kind of managing people, because you had a staff, a volunteer staff that you somehow had to get things done through, and that was a new experience for me.
Okay. Any other clubs or activities or government, student government?
No, most of my activity was wrapped around the yearbook.
Okay.
And it was fairly intensive activity, actually. I didn't have time for much else, and the school was about, maybe 14 miles away, and 2 changes of buses to get there. And so it took about an hour both directions, and so there wasn't much. It wasn't like being in a local high school where you kind of hung out and could get home in a few minutes and come back and so on. So most of my efforts, I had some long days, but most of them were centered on the yearbook.
Is there any particular teacher that you remember as having been influential during that time?
Well, Father French was was the director of the yearbook, and a very unusual person. But there were a lot of unusually good teachers in that school, and I think that was part of my blossoming as a late bloomer in terms of academics, at least.
Okay. How do you think you would be described, or would describe yourself as a student, socially and academically?
I would be described more academically than socially, I think, at that particular time. I was very involved in what I did. I did do things socially. I dated. I had girlfriends and so on, but it was not like it is today. I mean, it was kind of an all boys high school, and there wasn't quite the sociability as you'd find in other high school environments.
And so, what did you like most about school?
Learning.
So it ties back into your book reading as a younger person.
Right. It was a time when I really learned a lot that I use and still use today, and it was a time when I built confidence about my capabilities of learning, and so it was an important watershed for me. Okay.
Did you receive any sort of high school honors or recognitions while you were there?
Yes, they had the Gabriel Richard Club, which was the order of priests that taught there were Canadian, and that was a Canadian priest that was outstanding, and that was it was kind of like an Oscar that you got for grades, and as I said, in my last 3 years, I earned it every semester, so I had all these Oscars set up.
Now, an interesting question, Bud. Did you have any teen idols when you were that age? Was there somebody in media or television or writing, someone who you sort of looked at and said, wow, that's the kind of person that I might want to be?
Well, I grew up in Detroit, as I said, and at that time, everybody was interested in baseball, and that was a time before free agency. So what happened is your baseball team stayed together. They didn't go in free agency and drift off, and so you got to know the players and the rosters and the batting averages, and you listened to the ball games on the radio, and I would think during that time most of my then heroes were baseball players like Joe DiMaggio and some of the Detroit Tigers and other outstanding baseball players of that era.
Mm-hmm. Good. Is there anything that people would find very surprising about you when you were a teenager, knowing it now?
I think most people would be surprised how I ended up as a professor. They would think probably that I would be a business person, because I worked from about age 12. I had paper routes. I worked as retail clerks. I worked at the post office at Christmas. I was continually working, and so I think most people would have thought, viewing that history, that I would continue on that path as opposed to going into academics.
Okay, let's shift now to college. How were you able to attend college, and why did you choose the college that you did to go to?
Well, that's another watershed point, I guess, and that is, my father worked at the Ford Motor Company, and the community there where I lived, everybody's father worked at the Ford Motor Company, but they started a program called the Ford Fund, and they awarded scholarships to the sons and daughters of Ford employees, not executives, but kind of middle management. There was a wage bracket in which your children qualified, and you took a standardized test, much like the SAT or ACT today, and they had a board of educators that picked the students, and I was lucky enough to win one of those scholarships, and it was a super scholarship because it paid all of your tuition and 80% of your room and board and all of your fees in any college in the country that you could get in. And if you went to a private school, they tossed in $500 extra a year. And I had already applied to Notre Dame, and that growing up in a Catholic family and a Catholic community, that was considered the epitome of education. So I had already applied and been accepted, and the answer is, I don't know how I would have paid for it if I actually went, because it was, at that time, it cost $750 a semester for room, board, and tuition, which was a lot of money in 1947. Yes. So anyhow, along comes this great scholarship, and we met at the Ford Motor Company. All of these students, there were about I think about 150 of them from all over the country, and they went to all different schools. I had the pleasure of coming back and addressing those students after I was in the doctoral program at Michigan State University. The incoming class is kind of a keynote speaker for their meeting, and
very nice. That
was fun. But it removed a big burden. My parents were willing to accept that, and I was working, but it solved a big problem, what would have been a big problem.
Now, did you have to work while you were a student at Notre Dame?
I did work while I was a student at Notre Dame. I also got involved in the yearbook there, and I served as editor my senior year and kind of associate editor my junior year, and I was active from my freshman year in the yearbook.
Now, as I understand it, most students at Notre Dame lived in the dormitories?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Did you belong to a fraternity while you were there?
They don't have fraternities.
Or
now sororities, since they're co-ed, and never have had. They have residence hall, and there was a good deal of history and cohesion around some of the residence halls. And some of them were very old and very windy in the winter, and I lived off campus one year, but I did work while I was in both on the yearbook and for wages.
Okay. What subjects did you study, and why did you study them?
Well, I started out as a chemical engineer because as I said in high school, I thought, well, you know, I'm a hotshot in chemistry and physics and so on. So I started out as a chemical engineer, and I ran into a thing called organic chemistry, and it dissuaded me from being an engineer, and I decided I would become an economist, and kind of a big leap away from engineering to economics, but it was a good move because I was much more suited as an economist than I was as an engineer. I would have been a bad engineer, I think. So, and I think I'm a fair economist.
So you were the first in your family to get a college degree.
Well, actually, my sister, my eldest sister, was the first in the family to get a college degree, but I was the second, and subsequently, both of my younger sisters got degrees, and two of them got master's degrees. Okay.
Was your family supportive of your children and you going to college?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that we were probably a middle-class family at a difficult time through the Depression and World War II. But in terms of allocating resources and being generally supportive, my parents were, I couldn't have asked for anything more.
Mm-hmm. Now, how do you think your college experience at Notre Dame prepared you for later years as an academic?
Well, I think first it was a sound education. I think second, what it did is it gives you a sense of independence, being away from home and far enough away so you had to figure out how to get your own laundry done and allocate your funds on a weekly basis, kind of manage your own life, as it were, and that's an important experience for a person, I think. So I think I got a good basic education. I ended up with a Bachelor of Arts in Education, and it provided me a sound foundation for the rest of my life and my teaching. So.
Now, why did you choose to go on beyond the undergraduate degree to get a master's and then finally a PhD?
Well, it's a funny story. I wanted to be a lawyer after I finished my undergraduate education, but I went to work for the Ford Motor Company. There was no reason why I had to go to work for the Ford Motor Company. I mean, it wasn't connected to the scholarship or anything. But as I said, Dearborn was a Ford town, and they were a big employer, and we arranged to get a job in actually it was in the automatic transmission division in Livonia, and I was a methods analyst of all things in a manufacturing operation, my first job. But it then I wanted to start law school part-time at the University of Detroit, but they only started in September, and I was getting actually a bit bored by my job, so I wanted to do something, and so the business school at University of Detroit offered courses every quarter, and so I started into the business school, waiting till the next year when I would go into law school. Well, I got kind of hooked on the business courses, and at the same time, at that time I had moved to one of the automotive division sales offices, and I was doing well. I was making more money, and I was progressing.
The Supply Chain Doctor interviews thought leaders and visionaries who have had an impact on the field of supply chain management, shares professional development concepts for practitioners, and investigates current and future trends in the industry. Interested in sponsoring this show to help you get your message out? Send a note to chris@thescdr.com. We can also help with world-class supply chain education and workshops for you and your team. Thanks for listening.